This is Dr.RED Panda.
There was a time when one of the most expensive medicines in Europe was a dead Egyptian, ground into powder, mixed into drinks, and swallowed. This wasn't witchcraft. It wasn't some secret cult. It was mainstream medicine. Doctors prescribed it. Even kings believed in it. Hi, I'm Dr. Red Panda, and today we're uncovering one of history's strangest medical obsessions. Thousands of ancient mummies were ripped from their tombs, not to be studied, but to be eaten. So how did Europe convince itself that consuming the dead could save the living? Europe's most shocking medicine. How eating the dead became a medical miracle. Imagine walking into a pharmacy and asking for medicine. The pharmacist reaches behind the counter, pulls out a small paper bag, and calmly says, "Take 1 spoonful of Egyptian mummy twice a day." You'd probably leave immediately, or call the police. But for hundreds of years, this was completely normal. Across Europe, pharmacies openly sold powdered Egyptian mummies as medicine. Doctors prescribed it. Wealthy families kept it at home. Even kings believed it could heal the sick. And yes, they were literally eating dead people. Not because they were starving. Not because of some strange religious ritual. Because they genuinely believed it worked. It sounds too bizarre to be true. Like one of those fake history facts people share online. Except this one is completely real. For nearly 5 centuries, thousands of ancient Egyptian bodies were dug out of their tombs, shipped across the Mediterranean, ground into powder, and swallowed by people who hoped it would cure everything from headaches and stomach aches to broken bones and epilepsy. Some even believed it could stop internal bleeding. Others claimed it could prolong life. The more ancient the mummy, the better the medicine, or so people thought. The strange part isn't that a few desperate people tried it. The strange part is that almost everyone accepted it. Doctors recommended it. Pharmacists sold it. Scholars defended it. The wealthy paid enormous sums for the finest specimens. No one thought this was horrifying. To them, it was simply healthcare. Looking back today, it's almost impossible not to laugh. Imagine your doctor saying, "Your blood pressure looks a little high. I'd recommend half a teaspoon of 2,000-year-old Egyptian before breakfast." You'd probably ask for a second opinion. Back then, that was the second opinion. So how did an entire continent convince itself that eating ancient corpses was perfectly reasonable? Surprisingly, it didn't begin with madness. It began with a misunderstanding. A single word. That word was mumia. Centuries ago, mumia didn't originally mean a preserved Egyptian body. It referred to a black, sticky substance called bitumen, a natural form of asphalt that was believed to have medicinal properties in parts of the Middle East. Whether bitumen actually helped anyone is still debatable. But at least it wasn't human. When European scholars translated Arabic medical texts, something went terribly wrong. They confused the medicinal substance with the preserved bodies found in Egyptian tombs, many of which were coated with dark resins that looked similar. To them, the connection seemed obvious. Dark substance, Egypt, medicine, same thing. It was a small mistake. But history has a habit of turning small mistakes into enormous disasters. Because once Europeans believed healing came from Egyptian mummies, there was only one logical solution: find more mummies. And soon, the world would discover there weren't nearly enough dead Egyptians to satisfy Europe's growing appetite. The mummy black market. When Europe ran out of dead Egyptians. At first, nobody thought there would ever be a shortage. After all, Egypt had spent thousands of years burying its dead. Ancient cemeteries stretched across the desert, filled with countless mummies preserved by the dry climate. To European merchants, it must have seemed like an endless supply. It wasn't. As more physicians prescribed mummy powder and more wealthy families wanted it in their medicine cabinets, demand exploded. Merchants kept arriving in Egypt, buying every mummy they could find. Before long, the obvious happened. Europe wanted more mummies than Egypt could provide. And whenever demand becomes greater than supply, someone figures out how to cheat. Instead of searching for genuine ancient mummies, Some dealers began taking shortcuts. Historical accounts describe bodies that were dried, coated with dark resins, wrapped in linen, and sold as authentic Egyptian mummies. Some were only decades old. Some may have been the bodies of executed criminals or the poor. Imagine paying a fortune for a 2,500-year-old Egyptian priest, only to receive someone who had been alive a few weeks earlier. Counterfeit medicine isn't a modern invention. It was already a thriving business 400 years ago. Not everyone was fooled. The famous French surgeon Ambrose Pare looked at mummy medicine and wasn't impressed. He wrote that he had never seen it produce the miraculous cures people claimed. In his opinion, patients often became worse instead of better. But Pare had a problem. Evidence wasn't nearly as powerful as reputation. If respected doctors prescribed mummy, if famous scholars defended it, if wealthy nobles bought it, then most people assumed it had to work. After all, why would so many educated people be wrong? History has shown that's a surprisingly dangerous question. Even royalty joined the trend. England's King Charles II reportedly used a remedy known as the King's Drops, made from powdered human skull. It was an Egyptian mummy, but it came from the same strange medical belief that human remains contained a powerful life force that could be transferred to the living. Today, that sounds horrifying. Back then, it sounded scientific. The mummy trade became incredibly profitable. Merchants organized shipments from Egypt to Europe on a massive scale. Travelers described warehouses filled with mummies waiting to be loaded onto ships crossing the Mediterranean. Try to picture the scene. Wooden crates stacked from floor to ceiling. Workers carrying bodies instead of barrels. Merchants arguing over prices. Ship captains checking cargo lists. Everything looked like ordinary international trade, except the cargo was thousands of years old. Ancient Egyptians had survived scorching deserts, grave robbers, collapsing kingdoms, and the passage of time, only to end up being crushed into powder because someone in Europe had a headache. History can be unintentionally hilarious. The truly remarkable part is that the trade continued for centuries. Not because the medicine worked, but because people believed it worked. And belief is one of the most powerful forces in history. Once enough people are convinced that something can save their lives, it becomes incredibly difficult to change their minds. Every recovery became proof the medicine worked. Every failure was blamed on taking too little, taking it too late, or buying poor quality mummy. It's a pattern that feels surprisingly familiar. Eventually, fake mummies became so common that buyers could no longer be certain what they were swallowing. Was it an ancient Egyptian noble, a recently buried farmer, or simply whatever the merchant could find? At that point, it almost didn't matter. People kept buying it anyway, because by then, the real product was no longer the mummy. It was hope. By this point, Europe wasn't really buying mummies anymore. It was buying belief. So where did that belief come from? Why did they believe it, when hope became stronger than evidence? The answer is surprisingly simple. People weren't stupid. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. Today, if you have a headache, you can buy medicine that has been tested on thousands of people in carefully controlled clinical trials. Doctors can look at X-rays, MRI scans, blood tests, and decades of scientific research before recommending a treatment. None of that existed 500 years ago. Back then, medicine worked very differently. If a respected physician said something worked, people believed him. If a famous scholar wrote it down, later generations repeated it. And if a king took a particular remedy and happened to survive, that was often considered powerful evidence. Authority mattered far more than experimentation. That's why mummy medicine lasted for centuries. Not because it had been proven, but because almost nobody knew how to prove anything in the first place. Ironically, many patients probably recovered after taking mummy powder. Not because the powder cured them, but because many illnesses naturally improve on their own. If your fever disappears 3 days after taking a mysterious medicine, it's easy to give the medicine the credit. That's a trap our brains still fall into today. Humans are remarkably good at spotting patterns. Sometimes we're a little too good. We connect events that aren't actually connected. One coincidence becomes a story becomes common knowledge, and eventually common knowledge starts to feel like undeniable truth. History is full of examples like this. For centuries, doctors believed bloodletting could cure disease. People once thought smoking could be good for your health. Even in modern times, miracle cures regularly appear online, promising impossible results with little evidence behind them. The details change. Human nature doesn't. That's what makes the story of mummy medicine so fascinating. It's easy to laugh at people who swallowed powdered Egyptian corpses. And honestly, a little laughter is deserved. But if we stop there, we miss the real lesson. The people buying mummy medicine weren't villains. They weren't irrational monsters. Most were frightened parents trying to save a sick child. Desperate families hoping a loved one might recover. Patients willing to try anything when nothing else seemed to work. In other words, they were people, just like us. When fear meets uncertainty, hope becomes incredibly valuable. And hope has always been something others are willing to sell. That's why the story isn't really about mummies. It's about how easily confidence can replace evidence, how authority can silence skepticism, and how desperately humans search for certainty when life feels uncertain. Maybe that's the strangest part of all. 500 years from now, future generations may look back at some of our own beliefs and wonder, how could they possibly have thought that worked? Just as we now wonder how anyone could have looked at a 2,000-year-old Egyptian mummy and thought, yes, I'd like a spoonful of that. History has a habit of humbling every generation. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you had lived in Europe 400 years ago, surrounded by doctors, scholars, and even kings all praising mummy medicine, do you think you would have believed them? Be honest. It's easy to say no from the comfort of the 21st century. But history suggests most of us probably would have. And that's exactly what makes stories like this worth remembering. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm DR.RED Panda. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.